We thought she had no family. That was the exact sentence the charge nurse whispered under her breath, her trembling fingers wrapped tightly around mine, while my 88-year-old grandmother sat less than 3 feet away in a cracked vinyl chair beside a sealed, sun-baked window that no one had bothered to open in months. 3 weeks ago, I drove 9 agonizing hours south down the interstate without warning, heading straight for the supposedly prestigious, 5-star luxury senior living facility that my mother and uncle had promised was the best care money could buy. What I actually found was my beloved grandmother, Ruth, sitting completely alone in the sweltering heat, unwashed for days, shivering inside a paper examination gown beside the blackened, brittle remains of a gardenia plant she had faithfully kept alive for 30 years. And while that suffocating room reeked of commercial disinfectant masking profound neglect, my mother and my older sister were posting smiling photographs from Caribbean beaches, lavishly spending the very pension and equity that were earmarked to keep our matriarch safe, comfortable, and dignified in her final years. My name is Hazel Calloway. I am 43 years old, an independent floral shop owner in Atlanta, and historically, the daughter my family never took seriously. In their eyes, I was merely the soft, unambitious girl who spent her days playing with flowers, while my corporate relatives chased prestige, executive titles, and social status. But standing in that neglected room 3 weeks ago, I pulled out my phone and meticulously photographed every piece of undeniable physical evidence: the dusty, locked window overlooking a brick wall, the undignified paper gown tied loosely around her frail shoulders, the shriveled root system of the dead gardenia, the cold, congealed food tray sitting out of reach, and the brass room number bolted beside the door. My family had spent years treating me like a decorative afterthought, but they had no idea that the calculated lie written into my grandmother's intake file was about to make every single one of those fraudulent 5 stars come crashing down. The unraveling of their cruel deception truly began on a rainy Tuesday morning at my flower shop in Atlanta, when a priority floral arrangement I had personally crafted and shipped 3 states away was unceremoniously returned to my doorstep, unopened and battered. The cardboard delivery box was sitting on my wet concrete steps when I arrived before dawn to unlock the shop, its bottom corner soaked through and crumbling from the heavy morning dew. I recognized the packaging before I even bent down to read the shipping manifest. I had tied that wide, ivory satin ribbon with my own hands 3 days earlier, carefully nestling pristine white gardenia blossoms and sprigs of fragrant garden rosemary into the floral moss, the signature arrangement I reserved exclusively for the few people in this world who genuinely mattered to my heart. Tucked beneath the satin bow was my own handwritten birthday card: "Happy 88th birthday, Grandma Ruth. Still blooming, just like you." The delivery courier was standing beside his van with an electronic clipboard in hand, deliberately avoiding eye contact with me as I lifted the damp parcel. When I pressed him for an explanation, asking why a perishable gift for a resident in an assisted living community had been rejected at the door, he simply turned the box around to show me the heavy red and white sticker that the facility's administrative office had slapped directly over my shipping label. The official stamped text was cold, clinical, and completely monstrous: "Return to sender, no responsible party on file." I stood on that rain-slicked sidewalk, clutching the bruised flowers I had tenderly cultivated for the woman who raised me, struggling to comprehend how an upscale residential facility 3 states away could legally declare that Ruth Calloway belonged to absolutely no one. Nobody had even bothered to untie the ribbon or read the card. An hour later, as I trimmed stems in the back room of my shop, my fingers carried the sharp, bruised green scent of freshly cut sap, a fragrance that transported me back to my grandmother's garden in South Georgia. Grandma Ruth was the person who taught me the language of flowers long before I could spell my name in grade school. She would take my small childhood hands into hers, press my fingers into rich compost, and show me how to diagnose a plant's thirst simply by observing the subtle loss of color along a leaf. My mother and sister had spent my adult life turning my passion into a condescending joke. At holiday dinners, my mother, Brenda, would take a sip of wine, look across the table at me, and announce, "When are you going to abandon this little hobby and find a real career, Hazel?" My sister, Whitney, the marketing vice president with the lake house, would laugh on cue, basking in our mother's favoritism. I was labeled as the weak, overly sensitive sister who lacked practical ambition. Yet Grandma Ruth never laughed at my choices. Whenever my mother made those cutting remarks, Ruth would pull me aside, cup my chin in her weathered palms, and look straight into my eyes. You notice when a living thing is dying, Hazel. That isn't a weakness, that is a rare gift. That profound gift of noticing was precisely what led me back to her. The gardenia plant that sat dead on her windowsill was a living piece of our family history. 30 years ago, following my grandfather Walter's passing, I took a green cutting from the heirloom bush he had planted beside their porch on their wedding day. I rooted that cutting in a jelly jar on my windowsill, potted it in rich soil, and gave it to my grandmother. Ruth kept that gardenia alive through 3 decades, 2 moves, and a hurricane, faithfully watering it with rainwater, and speaking to it like a companion. During her last clear birthday, she told me in tears of joy that the plant had produced a pure white bloom in January. "Your grandfather is showing off from heaven," she whispered. 3 weeks before that returned package landed on my shop steps, my regular communication with my grandmother had abruptly gone dark. Ruth's personal telephone went straight to a dead dial tone, and every time I called the main administrative switchboard at Camellia Reserve, the receptionist placed me on indefinite hold until the line automatically disconnected. When I texted my mother to ask why Grandma wasn't picking up her phone, Brenda's reply arrived within 60 seconds, smooth, dismissive, and dripping with manufactured reassurance. "Grandma is in the absolute best facility in the state, Hazel. The doctors are managing her routine adjustments. Stop hovering and stop worrying." I stared at that single text message on my glowing screen in the dark of my kitchen until the backlight went out. My instincts, honed by 30 years of reading the subtle signs of decay, screamed that something was terribly wrong. I walked over to the key hook by the front door, grabbed my car keys, and left Atlanta before the morning sun even touched the horizon. The drive down Interstate 75 South was 9 hours of Georgia pines, flat asphalt, and complete silence. I drove with the radio off, stopping twice for fuel, unable to swallow food as a cold weight tightened beneath my ribs with every mile marker. When I finally pulled into the visitor parking lot of Camellia Reserve in Central Florida, the facility looked exactly like the multi-million-dollar brochure my mother had circulated. The exterior featured pale stucco architecture, royal palms swaying in the breeze, and an ornate brass sign announcing Camellia Reserve, the gold standard in 5-star senior living. Inside the grand foyer, a crystal chandelier cast fractured light across polished marble floors, while the scent of manufactured lemongrass was pumped through vents to mask the underlying medicinal odors of a nursing home. An indoor fountain burgeoned with water lilies, and the oak reception desk was decorated with orchids beneath a wall displaying framed photographs of smiling staff members. The receptionist behind the marble counter offered a bright, rehearsed smile. "Welcome to Camellia Reserve. Are you here for a scheduled tour?" "I am here to visit Ruth Calloway," I replied, my voice steady despite the exhaustion settling into my joints. The receptionist typed the name into her terminal, her cheerful expression suddenly faltering. She scrolled down the database, furrowed her brow, and typed the name again. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice dropping into a guarded tone as she tilted the monitor away from my view. "Our records indicate that this resident has no authorized family contacts on file. She is listed as having no surviving relatives." I did not waste my breath arguing with a front desk gatekeeper. I glanced down at the emergency evacuation map beside the counter, located the memory care wing, and walked past the double-access doors while she called out behind me about visitor sign-in protocols. The moment I crossed into the residential corridors, the luxurious facade completely evaporated. The lemongrass fragrance vanished, replaced by the suffocating stench of stale sweat, urine, and floor bleach. The plush carpeting gave way to scuffed linoleum. The wide hallways were eerily deserted, devoid of the engaging activities enrichment therapists, or vibrant community life advertised in the promotional materials. I walked past room after room until I reached the end of the hall, room 214. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside, and the scene felt like a physical blow to the chest. My grandmother was sitting entirely alone in an institutional vinyl armchair, angled awkwardly away from the single window. Her silver hair, which she had meticulously styled her entire life, was heavily matted on one side and greasy at the roots from weeks of neglected hygiene. She was wearing a cheap paper hospital gown, loosely tied at the neck, leaving her frail shoulders exposed to the freezing blast of the overhead air vent. The emergency call button was wrapped around the top bed rail, positioned completely out of her physical reach against the far wall. On the rolling meal cart sat a cold lunch tray. A thick, congealed skin formed over a bowl of unidentifiable soup, accompanied by a carton of sour milk. And there, resting on the dusty windowsill beside her, was my grandfather's gardenia plant. The leaves were entirely black, shriveled into brittle husks, and the dry soil had pulled away from the ceramic pot in a cracked ring of complete abandonment. 30 years of love, history, and survival had been reduced to dead tinder, because not a single caregiver, in that multi-thousand-dollar facility, had bothered to pour a half cup of water into the soil for 2 months. "Grandma," I whispered, my voice breaking in the cold room. There was no response. I stepped forward, kneeling directly beside her chair. "Grandma, it's Hazel. I came to see you." Ruth slowly turned her frail head toward me. Her pale blue eyes scanned my face with a blank, polite, and detached expression, the hollow look of a person who has spent months in solitary confinement. She looked at me as if I were a stranger who had entered the wrong room. Before I could speak another word, rapid footsteps sounded in the doorway behind me. I turned around to see a nurse in faded scrubs holding a medication cup, staring at me in wide-eyed astonishment. "Are you her family?" the nurse asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I am her granddaughter," I stated with quiet firmness. The nurse's face drained of color. She immediately set the medication cup down on the wooden dresser, closed the door behind her, and took both of my hands into hers. Her palms were warm, but they were shaking with intense nervous energy as she lowered her voice to a desperate whisper. "We were told she had no family left in the world. It is explicitly written in her primary intake chart, no visiting relatives, no family contacts, no outside advocates." And right at that moment, as the nurse spoke those horrifying words, my grandmother looked directly into my eyes. For a single, fleeting second, the heavy cognitive fog that clouded her mind seemed to pull back, and she spoke in a thin, clear, heartbreaking voice that tore through my soul. They told me that you all stopped loving me." I did not allow myself to cry in that room. Crying is a luxury, and my grandmother needed a protector, not a weeping bystander. I immediately pulled out my smartphone and began documenting room 214. I captured photographs of the unwashed bedding, the unreachable emergency call cord, the congealed food tray, the blackened gardenia, the paper gown, and the brass room plate. While I was documenting the scene, the door swung open, and an imposing man in his mid-50s stepped inside, surrounded by a heavy cloud of designer cologne and unearned confidence. He was dressed in a tailored suit, carrying an expensive leather portfolio, wearing the practiced, reassuring smile of an executive who manages liability. "Good afternoon. I am Spencer Vance, the executive director of Camellia Reserve," he announced, extending a manicured hand that I refused to take. "You must be relieved to see firsthand how wonderfully your grandmother is thriving in our memory care community." Without waiting for response, Vance guided me toward the executive wing, ushering me into a staged model suite featuring plush duvets, silk floral arrangements, and framed schedules boasting daily chair yoga, music therapy, and salon services. He opened his leather portfolio and presented daily care charts filled with neat checkmarks: bathing, assisted daily; grooming, completed daily; nutrition, monitored daily; Physical enrichment, fully engaged. At Camellia Reserve, compassionate care is the core of our identity, Vance declared smoothly. I looked him in the eye and asked why my grandmother was sitting in her own filth wearing a paper gown beside a dead plant if his records claimed she had been bathed that morning. Vance's practiced smile never faltered. Dementia is a tragic journey for families, Miss Calloway, he replied in a patronizing cadence. Residents frequently experience behavioral fluctuations and pull at their clothing. What you are experiencing right now, this surge of guilt, is a completely natural reaction for relatives who have been absent from day-to-day care. I sat in the sweltering car in the visitor parking lot, the midday Florida heat radiating off the asphalt, and stared down at the glowing screen of my phone. The glossy photo on my sister Whitney's profile mocked me, turquoise Caribbean water, a private catamaran, and a cocktail held high under the sun, with my mother Brenda's comment about earning their paradise. I dialed my mother's number with shaking fingers. When Brenda answered, the ocean breeze and laughter came through the speaker. I told her in a steady voice that I was sitting outside Camellia Reserve, that I had found Grandma Ruth abandoned in a paper gown with matted hair beside a dead gardenia, and that the facility had scrubbed her family from her records. My mother responded with sharp anger, accusing me of inventing drama to play the hero, claiming Ruth was deeply delusional and that I had no right to question her care when I had never contributed to her financial burden. I called Whitney next, only to be met with dismissive laughter before a male voice in the background called her back to the photo shoot. Sitting in that parking lot, the cold weight in my chest settled into absolute resolve. Over the next 72 hours, I refused to leave Central Florida. I rented a motel room, set up a workspace on the desk, and retained Gloria Vance Reynolds, a veteran elder law attorney recommended by a legal aid society. Gloria met me at the county recorder's office the next morning, where a clerk slid a stack of public land records across the counter. As Gloria flipped through the deeds, her highlighter stopped on a document recorded the previous October. It was a reverse mortgage executed against my late grandfather Walter's house. Walter had spent 40 years working overtime to pay off that brick home, so Ruth would never worry about housing in her old age. The house had been free and clear for decades, yet 7 months earlier, my uncle Roy, armed with a power of attorney, had encumbered the property with a $185,000 loan. $90,000 had been wired to Camellia Reserve as an entrance fee, while $95,000 had been transferred into an account controlled exclusively by Roy. Gloria pointed out the fatal flaw in the package. The signature on the reverse mortgage was an erratic scrawl that barely resembled my grandmother's handwriting, dated 4 weeks after an evaluation had diagnosed Ruth with moderate to severe cognitive impairment, scoring her 14 out of 30 on the dementia scale. Under state law, a person lacking capacity could not execute a binding mortgage, meaning the transaction was fraudulent. Furthermore, Gloria pulled banking records connected to Ruth's income. My grandmother received a monthly pension and Social Security totaling $5,750. The actual care level billed by Camellia Reserve for room 214 was a bare-bones rate of $2,800 a month. That left nearly $3,000 in surplus every month that Roy and my mother were siphoning directly from Ruth's account to fund luxury ski trips in Aspen, vineyard tours in California, and Whitney's yacht charters. When I confronted my Uncle Roy over the phone from Gloria's office, asking why my grandmother was placed in substandard conditions while her pension and home equity were drained, Roy became defensive. He shouted that 5-star facilities cost money, that he had handled everything legally through Spencer Vance, and that I was out of my depth. He hung up without asking how his 88-year-old mother was doing physically. I noted the date, time, and content of the call in my notebook, feeling the anger inside me crystallize into cold determination. We were not dealing with family distance or miscommunication. This was a calculated extraction scheme, where my family provided the vulnerable senior, and Spencer Vance provided the institutional wall of silence to keep her hidden from the world. The next morning at 7 a.m., I returned to Camellia Reserve to visit my grandmother. When I pushed open the door to room 214, the scene had transformed. A warm washcloth was folded over the sink, and a fresh plate of scrambled eggs, sliced oranges, and toast sat on the table. Standing behind Ruth's chair was Camilla, the young nursing assistant who had spoken to me on my first day. Camilla was gently working a comb through my grandmother's silver hair, parting it softly and speaking to her in a soothing whisper. She had even retrieved Ruth's flip phone from the drawer and plugged it into the charger beside the nightstand so my grandmother could look at saved photos on the screen. Camilla explained that she had been providing Ruth with extra food and care out of her own pocket for months whenever supervisors weren't looking, simply because she couldn't bear to see an elderly woman left in isolation. Camilla whispered critical intelligence that would break the facility's defenses. She told me that the daily care logs presented to visiting families by Spencer Vance were complete fabrications generated by the administrative office. The real floor logs, handwritten and signed by direct care aides, were stored in a locked cabinet in the rear nurses' station. In those true records, aides documented that Ruth had gone weeks without a bath, that meals were left uneaten due to staffing shortages, and that supervisors had instructed them not to report physical decline to outside agencies. I brought a potted white gardenia from my car, setting it on the windowsill, and used my shears to take a green cutting from the base of the dead plant, placing it in a glass of water where the sun could reach it. My grandmother smiled, stroked the living petals, and for a few minutes, her memory returned with clarity as she reminisced about grandfather Walter. But when her lucidity faded, she clutched my sleeve, whispering that she had tried calling my mother dozens of times, only for the phone to ring endlessly. That evening, as I walked through the parking lot toward my car, an unfamiliar woman stepped out from the shadows of an adjacent vehicle, holding a thick manila envelope against her chest. She was dressed in a tailored blazer, wearing an expensive watch, but her face was etched with deep exhaustion. She introduced herself in a low voice as Diane Vance, the estranged wife of Spencer Vance. Diane handed me the envelope, warning me not to open it until I was safely behind locked doors. She revealed that she had once worked as the primary bookkeeper for Camellia Reserve, and that she had spent 4 years secretly maintaining an exact shadow ledger of the facility's fraudulent double-billing practices. Diane confessed that my grandmother was not an isolated incident. She was one of 11 different residents whose families had been systematically exploited. Spencer Vance specifically targeted families where a greedy power of attorney holder could be co-opted, promising them financial kickbacks while cutting resident care to the bone. When I met Diane at a diner the next morning, she slid a photograph across the table that knocked the breath out of my lungs. It was an image taken 6 weeks earlier at a marina resort in South Florida, showing Spencer Vance laughing at an outdoor bar with his arm wrapped familiarly around my sister Whitney's waist. Diane explained that Spencer made a habit of seducing and charming the most influential daughters of his wealthiest residents, using romantic flattery and lavish dinners to ensure they remained complicit and never looked closely at the facility's financial statements. Whitney had not merely turned a blind eye out of laziness, she was romantically involved with the very director who was neglecting our grandmother, completely blinded by his wealth and charm, treating him like a glamorous conquest while he systematically looted our family's inheritance. With the shadow ledger, the true handwritten logs, the reverse mortgage documents, and the photographic evidence, Gloria and I prepared an unassailable legal trap. Gloria filed emergency petitions in probate court for temporary guardianship, an adult protective services intervention, and a formal freeze on the mortgage proceeds. Simultaneously, we coordinated with an investigative journalist from the regional newspaper and the chief state ombudsman for long-term care. Rather than engaging in a premature confrontation that would allow Spencer Vance and my Uncle Roy to settle quietly, we chose to remain silent. I stopped calling the administration, stopped sending emails, and allowed Spencer Vance to believe that I was just another defeated relative who had run out of resources. We knew that Camellia Reserve was hosting its 5th anniversary gala that upcoming Saturday, a public open house attended by prospective families, media, donors, and healthcare executives. I called my mother Brenda on Thursday afternoon, keeping my voice sweet and composed. I told her that I had realized my previous behavior was overly emotional, that I wanted to make amends, and that she and Whitney should attend the anniversary celebration in formal attire because the facility was planning a special family tribute. Brenda was ecstatic, completely convinced that I had surrendered to the family narrative, and promised to arrive early with Whitney. On Saturday afternoon, the grand ballroom of Camellia Reserve was staged with breathtaking opulence. A classical string quartet played in the corner, towering ice sculptures dripped into crystal basins. A champagne fountain bubbled near the entrance, and a 2-story satin banner proclaimed 5 years of 5-star compassionate senior living. Dozens of prospective families in designer suits strolled through the halls, nodding approvingly as staff handed out champagne and polished brochures. Spencer Vance stood at the podium in a custom tuxedo, holding a crystal flute, delivering a rehearsed keynote address about how every resident at Camellia Reserve was treated as beloved family. When he reached the conclusion of his speech, he looked out across the smiling crowd and announced that he wanted to invite a resident's family member to the microphone to offer an authentic testimonial about the facility's exceptional care. Spotting me standing near the front row beside my beaming mother and radiant sister, Vance assumed his charm had neutralized me. He smiled broadly, extended his hand, and invited me onto the stage. My mother gave me an encouraging nod, whispering for me to make the family proud. I stepped up to the wooden podium, adjusted the microphone, and felt an unshakable calm wash over every nerve in my body. I opened my folder, looked Spencer Vance dead in his eyes, and began to speak with a clear voice that echoed into every corner of the silent hall. My grandmother is Ruth Calloway, and she sits in room 214 down the neglected corridor behind those double doors. I want to read this room the truth about your 5-star care. I held up the glossy marketing log Vance had provided, reading the fabricated entries about daily spa baths and music therapy, before holding up the true handwritten aid logs directly beside it, reading the continuous records of skipped meals, denied hygiene, and physical neglect. When Vance attempted to step forward and laugh off my statements, as the ramblings of a disgruntled relative, I pulled out the certified county land records and displayed the forged reverse mortgage on my grandfather's house, alongside the evaluation proving Ruth lacked legal capacity. The ballroom descended into an absolute, horrified silence as prospective families froze with their champagne glasses in hand and the investigative reporter began filming from the aisle. I then placed Diane Vance's master shadow ledger on the podium, announcing that 11 other resident families had been subjected to the exact same predatory extraction scheme over 4 years. Finally, I pulled out my grandmother's flip phone, connected it to the house audio system, and played the heartbreaking voice memo Ruth had recorded in secret from her vinyl chair, her frail, trembling voice pleading with whoever found the phone to please take her home, because she knew where she was and she wasn't crazy. I looked directly at my mother, whose face had collapsed into pale terror, and announced to the room that Ruth had dialed her personal number 31 times in 3 weeks while Brenda ignored every call to post beach photos funded by stolen pension checks. I then laid the photograph of Spencer Vance embracing Whitney at the marina on the display screen, exposing my sister's complicity before the entire room. Before Vance or my family could utter a word of defense, the chief state ombudsman and 2 uniformed investigators from the State Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Division stepped through the rear doors, officially serving Spencer Vance with an immediate cease and desist order and placing the entire facility under emergency state regulatory receivership. The ballroom erupted into chaos as photographers' flashes illuminated the panic on Vance's face, prospective clients demanded their deposits back, and Whitney ran from the stage in tears of public humiliation. My mother sat frozen in her front row chair, stripped of every ounce of social standing, staring in horror at the ruined wreckage of the image she had worshipped for 40 years. I did not yell, I did not celebrate, and I did not gloat. I simply gathered my documents, stepped down from the platform, and walked out of the room. 48 hours later, the county probate court formally granted me sole emergency legal guardianship over Ruth Calloway, while simultaneously stripping my Uncle Roy of all power of attorney rights, and freezing his bank accounts pending criminal indictment. On Monday morning, I personally wheeled my grandmother through the front doors of Camellia Reserve for the very last time, past the wilting orchids and the abandoned reception desk. Resting securely in her lap was the glass of water holding the living green gardenia cutting, which had pushed out 3 fresh, bright white roots over the weekend. As we stepped out into the warm Florida sunshine, Ruth closed her eyes, tilted her face up to the sky, and took a deep breath of fresh air, whispering with a peaceful smile, "Is it spring out here, Hazel?" I squeezed her soft hand, kissed her forehead, and replied, "Yes, Grandma. It is finally spring." In the months that followed, the justice system moved with relentless precision. Spencer Vance and my Uncle Roy were indicted on felony counts of elder abuse, grand theft, forgery, and healthcare fraud, resulting in the revocation of Camellia Reserve's operating license and massive civil restitution judgments that wiped out their assets. The fraudulent reverse mortgage on my grandfather's house was rescinded by the court, preserving Walter's home in its rightful trust. Whitney severed ties with Vance, retreating into quiet obscurity after resigning from her job, while my mother was completely ostracized from her church circles. I relocated my grandmother to a private elder care cottage 15 minutes from my flower shop in Atlanta, where her room is perpetually filled with the fragrance of blooming white gardenias. Grandma Ruth lives in peace and dignity, surrounded by love, soft blankets, and people who truly see her. My family spent decades dismissing me as the quiet daughter who only worked with dirt and pruning shears, but in the end, they learned that the very hands trained to recognize when a living thing is dying are the exact hands strong enough to prune away the rot, expose the truth, and nurture justice back to life.